Hello and welcome to the Podawakens as we continue our High Republic Road to the Acolyte series. And we are talking Fallen Star today. My name is Jordan, and with me talking Fallen Star is Sean. How are you today, Sean?
How we doing? How we doing? Thanks for having
Good.
me on.
Yeah, thanks for answering my message. I mean, I keep saying this in each episode, but I really put it out there thinking I would get like one one reply. And then I would have to do like one episode about the whole phase or something. But actually was really shocked by how many people uh messaged me back, whether it was email, tweets, or Instagram, Facebook, whatever. And I expanded. I was like, okay, we're gonna do one for every book then, pretty much, because I had so many guests. I wanted to be able to fit them all in.
No, that's perfect. I think everybody's really excited about not just the Acolyte, but the High Republic in general. It's really an exciting time in Star Wars content for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've read all most of phase one. What I would say is I read the adult books first and then was like, oops, missed some stuff. And then, started going back and reading some of the other ones. But especially I had started phase two and then I was like, you know what, let's go back. And for this
Hmm.
project of me doing this as anyway, I'm like, let me, actually revisit all of these or visit them for the first time. But yeah, I really enjoyed the High Republic, and I was shocked to see how many people have, because I feel like there's like certain narratives out there that it's not as popular, or I know people like in my circle that don't read the Star Wars books, and it's like. So for the podcast, I was like, "How am I going to cover this? How am I going to?" Because I wanted to get people, and this is for your information and for the listeners, I guess. If you haven't read this book and you don't care about spoilers, you can keep listening. We're gonna drop full spoilers for this Fallen Star, but also probably for all of Phase One at this point, because this is kind of the end of it. So, uh, just wanted to get that out of the way. But if you're somebody that just wants to know what the High Republic is like as we build up to the Acolyte, and you don't want to read or listen to audiobooks, or maybe hearing us talk about it will make you want to read or listen to those, then stay with us. We'll kind of explain certain things about the High Republic and the era itself, and how this phase one ends. But before we do that, I have a list of questions I like to ask my guests for their first time onto the podcast. But also, Sean, if you wanted to maybe drop where people can follow your work and your podcast for Star Wars.
Sure. So myself and Jedi John, we are the duo that run the Force Dyad Podcast. You can find us pretty much on all podcast platforms at this point, including YouTube Music, because I guess Google doesn't want to run a podcast platform anymore. But at Force Dyad on Twitter, and then Force Dyad Podcast on pretty much everywhere else: Facebook, Instagram, etc. So yeah, we just dropped our 70th episode, I think, last
Nice.
week. So obviously gearing up for the end of the Bad Batch. And I'm kind of in the same boat as you. John doesn't. He's just now getting to the High Republic, and so I haven't had a chance to really talk much about it. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about it tonight. But yeah, the Force Dyad Podcast, all podcast platforms. Come check us out.
Yes, check them out. All right, let's get into these questions. People listening by now probably have already heard these, but if not, it's just favorite Star Wars stuff that I'll be asking questions about. So, favorite Star Wars film?
So it's a toss up between two, Rogue One and Revenge of the Sith. I love the OT, don't get me wrong, but I'm gonna have to go Revenge of the Sith. It's one of those where uh, at the point in my life where it came out, uh, it was in high school. So or
Yeah.
no, yeah, I was in high school. Um, and so it was a true midnight show for me my senior year of high school. So it's like that kind of the end of everything. Obviously, was the end of that trilogy. So yeah, for me, it's Revenge of the Sith all day.
Such a weird time in Star Wars back then, because it was the end of that trilogy, but at that point George was saying it's the end of it all, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I was in 8th grade thinking, I mean, Star Wars is ending. And at that same time, like Lord of the Rings had already ended. Like I really only had like Harry Potter left at that.
Harry Potter, yeah, exactly.
You're like everything else was wrapping up. But do you remember like the novelization came out like a month or 2 months ahead of time? And I read that before I saw the movie, so obviously I knew everything that was going to happen. But um, the novelization was great. I was reading in class that stuff, and I just remember Anakin walking in late, and like Kit Fisto's head is on the desk, like beheaded or something, and I was like, "Dang!" And then that scene in the movie did not happen, and I was kind
I
of
was gonna say that did not make the final cut.
no, it did not.
We need like a Lucas Snyder cut type thing.
Yes, yeah. Give me the. Let's do Lucas cut. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's just a crazy time. So, favorite trilogy. You said you like the OT, but your favorite movie is from the PT. So, I'm guessing it's from one of those.
Yeah, it's again, it's kind of hard because, of course, not having the movies when I was a kid, I grew up watching the original trilogy. But and it kind of alludes to, I guess, my answer to to the next question you have. But for me, I love the prequels because of the characters they gave us. Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan is fantastic. You got Maul, the downfall. I mean, it's again the Luke storyline and everything like that. The Vader redemption arc and whatnot in the OT is phenomenal. But again, for where I was in my life, I gotta go with the prequels for all the roughness it had with some of the dialogue, perhaps. It has a special place in my heart for sure.
Yeah, interesting. I really love Phantom Menace. That's actually my favorite prequel, surprisingly. But that is my favorite. And then I love Revenge of the Sith. Attack of the Clones for me is probably my least favorite. So for me, that always drags down the trilogy as a whole. As a kid, I loved it though, because it was like you get to that Geonosis battle and you just see all those lightsabers, and you're like, yeah, this is this is what I've been
It's
wanting.
incredible. It's incredible. And I remember being in the theater. So Attack of the Clones for me is it's weird because the first half drags forever and then the last like
Yeah.
30 minutes is incredible. And well, I think it is anyways. But sitting in the theater and watching Yoda walk in and hobbled and hobbled,
Mm-hmm.
and then he Ataru's the first time, and you're like, "What is this?" Because you only ever know him from Empire Strikes Back, and I remember losing my mind as I was, because that was 2002, so I was 15 when that movie came out. I lost my mind. It was it was so cool. So I don't know. I agree with you. It's kind of the
Yeah.
slowest, but
It has a special place in my heart though, because it is the first one I saw in theater was Attack of the Clones. So I'm finally seeing Phantom Menace in theaters when it does its re-release. This episode is dropping after that, but I will have seen it. So I will have seen it by that point. But yeah, I'm just I don't I know I ask all these questions, but I really don't even know what my favorite would be. I guess I would go original trilogy just because I think it's probably the tighter of the
Mhm.
trilogies. But I truly do love them all. So I'm not like I don't have like any that I super hate or anything.
Right.
How about favorite TV show? And we can break this out into two here. So let's go animated first. Favorite animated television show for Star Wars.
I'm gonna go with. So for the record, I love all the animation.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen Resistance, so I can't really speak to that. But Rebels, Clone Wars, even Young Jedi Adventures, that's out now. It's all I love it. I'm probably gonna go Clone Wars, with Rebels of very very. It's like 1A 1B, and really it was season 7 of the Clone Wars that
Yeah.
kind of puts it top for me. But yeah, Clone Wars for just the depth that you get for us prequel kids. you get all that gap
Yeah.
filled, and it's just great.
Would you
So
be shocked if I told you that as of this recording, you're the first one to say that Clone Wars?
really,
Yeah.
what's
Uh,
the general answer, or what's the answer?
Rebels
Rebels.
have been overwhelmingly the favorite. It is my favorite too, and I always say because I feel like they are able to focus on the core group of Rebels, so you get better character development.
Hmm.
Um, Clone Wars, I just introduced it to my friend Logan, and we're doing watches on this podcast in chronological order. He's never watched any of the animated stuff, so really, he came to me and said, "Hey, why don't we, like I want to watch these." I was like, "Okay, we'll do it on the podcast." And he's really enjoying Clone Wars. Though he did just text me he watched the worst episode of Clone Wars yesterday. We're I think it's one of the R2 3PO specific episodes
Mm-hmm.
that he's referring to. But yeah, and that's my biggest fault with Clone Wars is that there are a lot of episodes that just um,
Miss.
miss. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I do really love it. Season 7 is a absolute triumph in it, especially those last 4 episodes.
They're incredible.
So favorite live action television show?
Andor.
Awesome. Yeah, you're the
Without
first one to say
without
that too, I think.
without question. Again, I like, going back to your movie thing. I like all Star Wars stuff.
Mhm.
Yes, some of the live action stuff's been, it's like Boba Fett really missed for me, and even Kenobi to an extent, at least in the early season, in the early episodes, kind of missed for me. But yeah, Andor for me is peak Star Wars. The writing, the acting, the grittiness, that real feel, if you will. Uh, yeah, I cannot wait for season 2. I am so stoked for season 2, even though I know it ends, where it ends.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
You
Andor for
watch
me is the
season
best.
2 and you're like, "Oh, I wonder what happens after this." Then you go to Rogue One.
Yeah,
Um no, I really enjoy Andor too. I've always described it as I think Andor is the highest quality thing that they produce, especially television wise. It's
hmm
not my favorite. I would probably still go with something like Mando or Ahsoka, but Andor I can appreciate as like the best thing that they've put out. It's like watching like golden era TV,
hmm
but in Star Wars. And it's something I really appreciate about it, especially getting to like the political aspect of it. Like that's one thing I always appreciate about the prequels. Just kind of seeing like the state of the galaxy and stuff like that, and you get to see it with people that are not super powered in
that
Andor, which I think is great.
that's the thing I think I enjoy most, is that it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And
Yeah,
in Star Wars, that, yes, it centers around, and for the most part, it's Force users and people with extraordinary abilities. But when it comes down to it, in that sort of str- uh, struggle for freedom, or fight against tyranny, etc., 99% of it's going to be from average folk. And so
right.
I love that Andor captures that.
Yeah, season 2 is going to be awesome. I love K2SO, so hopefully he's got a good role in it. How about favorite game? If you play any of the games,
Let's see. It's kind of a tough one, because I don't know if I want to go old school or new school.
how about give
Uh,
me new school and old school? Let's do that.
okay, so old school, I got to go Rogue Squadron on the N64. It was one of those things that, growing up, I think it was the first or second level with the X-wings over Mos Eisley. It was a blast. So yeah, that, and I played Pod Racer, Star Wars Pod
Mm.
Racer on the PC, which was, again, super fun. So like a new school game would be hmm, probably Jedi Survivor. So I mean, the Fallen Order and Survivor series has been fantastic.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know if you played Survivor or not,
Yes, I have.
but
Yeah.
I 100%ed I found every silly seed pod and holocron, datacron thing, whatever. I fought the stupid double rancor, spoiler alert, and everything like that. So yeah, I love the story and the characters, and yeah, it was a blast for me.
A little bit of a High Republic stuff in
That
there
also,
too.
that also.
No, yeah, I think Jedi Survivor took what Fallen Order did and did it so much better. It just felt
Mhm.
like the combat was better, the story I enjoyed more, the world, exploring the world was better. Like being able to, the way that they did the map, where it's like almost layered, right? Like there's times where you get to another shortcut and you're like, oh, I was here earlier.
Mhm.
And you figure out like, oh, I came all the way back to this point. Let me use this save spot, and then I can go back the other way. While like Fallen Order, it was a pain to get save spot to save spot at times. Enjoyable your first time, but if you were ever going back for anything else, you're like, okay, like this is
Mhm.
this is a struggle. I didn't 100% everything. I was close to it. I only need like two trophies for the platinum. I should probably, but one of them is like to go back and do the trial stuff, and I'm really bad
Yes,
at the trials that are like the force field things that you have to
where
jump
you got to
through,
jump
and
through and you
yeah,
got
I'm really
yes.
bad at
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, that made me want to throw my controller a few times.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I really do enjoy that. And then my favorite like old school game is usually um, Knights of the Old Republic, or like Battlefront 2,
Yeah,
the original Battlefront 2. I really enjoy too.
yes, both good, both great games.
And the Phantom Menace PS1 game was a lot of fun growing up too. Okay, and then how about if you read any of the old expanded universe? If you have a favorite of that. If not, we can just jump to your favorite of the new expanded universe, the canon books and all that.
Yeah, so I will say that my first Star Wars novel that I read was Light of the Jedi. I was very late to the Star Wars book game, but since I've started reading Heir to the Empire, which I'm enjoying. I bought a signed copy of the 20th anniversary. It's got Tim's annotations in the margins, which is pretty cool. So I'm enjoying that. But the ones that I've actually finished was the Darth Bane trilogy, which was awesome. Uh, Path of Destruction, Dynasty of Evil,
Mhm.
and what I forget the other one. But I was always curious about, learning more about Bane and stuff like that. And I listened to the audiobooks on a couple recent work trips and really, really enjoyed that story.
Yeah, I have yet to read Heir to the Empire. Uh, it is one that I have like the audiobook for. I also have the regular book for that I want to dive into. I did start reading the books like during that break of Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, and I started reading like there's a book series called Jedi Apprentice, which was written by Jude Watson. Um, she actually only wrote number 2 through 18. The first guy wrote like the first one, and then after that, Jude Watson took over. But it was a like kid series. Like, I mean, like they were like this thick, right? Like you could read them in a day, pretty large font. But it was like a chapter book. Um, Probably what we'd call middle grade nowadays. I don't know, but it was Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, and it was before
Mm,
episode 1, and it was from like Obi-Wan's perspective pretty much. We followed him most of the time, and it was just cool. I love that era, like the state of before episode 1. I think that's why I'm really excited for the Acolyte, and why I really liked High Republic is, all right, show me before Palpatine has really taken over. I want to see what the state of the galaxy was like at that point. And then I kind of started dipping more into the bigger books as I was older. But I'll tell you, I did sigh a sigh of relief when Disney announced that they were considering all of that not canon
mm.
and starting over, so I could be like, all right, I can start fresh again. And then I have fallen off on some of those, but yeah, I've really enjoyed, um, getting into that. So for the new expanded universe stuff, is your favorite like the High Republic stuff that you've read?
Yeah, so far, definitely. I have been going back and going through I think the new Thrawn books are canon, like the
Yes. Yeah.
Thrawn and then alliances and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So I did the Thrawn audiobook. I don't know, last month I think it was. I finished that up, and I really, really enjoyed that. The again the narration was
Hmm.
Awesome. But yeah, for the stories, because not only am I reading the High Republic books, but I'm also getting all of the comics,
Oh
even
wow.
High Republic Adventures, which is the the youth comic, I guess, if you will,
Yeah, yeah.
from Dark Horse, and so I am all in, at least from the adult novels and the comics for High Republic.
That's awesome. I started reading Light of the Jedi once it um came out. That one, as I mentioned on here before, it kind of took me a little bit to get into it. I was reading that one, not the audiobook one, but uh once I got to Rising Storm, I felt like it really took off. And I really enjoyed Rising Storm and Fallen Star. This is my favorite one, Fallen Star. But if we're just talking favorite book of the new canon, I really like Shadows of the Sith. So if you haven't read that, I
Yes,
recommend that.
that's Adam Christopher, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, where it's like between 6 and 7
Yep.
and features a lot of great uh, stuff about Rise of Skywalker and also ties in with the Mandalorian with the Tython like seeing stone that Grogu sits on. All
Hmm.
that stuff is really great. So do you have a favorite High Republic character, and if so, who is it?
I'm probably gonna say it's between. Well, yeah, for me, it's kind of between Bell and Elzar. I like Elzar just
Mm-hmm.
because of his. He's like the only, like, it seems like the only real person, right? Because he's got all this inner conflict
Right.
and stuff like that. Um, he's also one of the only ones who's seems to call people out, especially you kind of get that in Fallen Star too. Like he kind of calls Stellan out on a few things. So yeah, I guess Elzar probably for me.
It's a very popular selection. Elzar's been very popular when I ask this question. Mine is Bell and Stellan are my two favorites, but I do like Elzar as well. He's got
Honorable mention for Ember. Ember's a great
yes,
character.
Ember is so great. All right, so my favorite High Republic book is Fallen Star. What would you say yours is?
It's I probably probably Rising Storm.
Okay.
It's really close between Fallen Star and Rising Storm. Again, because I haven't really read a whole lot of the Phase 2 books yet. I started and then kind of, but yeah, I'm gonna go with how Cavan wrote that story.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like one tragedy after another, and reading it and then visualizing it like in your it's like one of those things where I couldn't put it down. I think I finished it in, for me, which is fast, probably about a week. So it was a quick read for me.
All right, so our main characters that we really focus on this book, I feel like you would say that this is a pretty big Stellan book, a pretty big Elzar book as well. But Elzar really had a big focus in Rising Storm. Um, we get some great Bell and Buryaga in this book as well. Um, but I really feel like Stellan kind of steals the show in this one. So what order did you read these things in? Did you because you said so you've only read the adult and the comics? Did you read any of the like young adult stuff?
No, I haven't delved into there was so much, obviously there's so much stuff.
Yeah.
I kind of had to be selective. So I started with the adult novels, read them in order: Light of the Jedi, Rising Storm, and
Okay.
then Fallen Star.
Yeah, because um so I always thought I knew they were doing like this multimedia, release of okay, we'll do middle grade, we'll do comics, we'll do, young adults. I kind of thought those characters would stay in their lanes a bit, right?
Mm,
But they don't. They kind of jump around quite a bit. And Light of the Jedi very focuses on Avar, and you also get Bell and Lode and all them. That I was really shocked when I went from that book to Rising Storm, and Fallen Star, and
Hmm.
Avar's barely in them, right? Like she is
He disappears. Yes.
pushed aside. She's in the comics. For people that don't know, she's kind of like in the comics doing things after Light of the Jedi.
Hmm.
Um, Interesting choices because like she is the on the front cover of Light of the Jedi. She's like front and center, and you're kind of thinking this is going to be like our main hero of the High Republic. And then you kind of wonder like they mention her quite a few times in these two books, and you're like, okay, when is she going to really show up again? And she really doesn't like that much. When I was reading Fallen Star, though, I was conscious of her being more in the comics. So I started reading the comics and would only go a few issues before then I have to like go back and listen to more of the book and then kind of go back to the comic. And I tried to sync up the fall of Starlight Beacon to both, like, juggling the two. But I just want to kind of get your thoughts on the initiative as a whole for this and how it worked with Fallen Star. Of, do you feel like you got to know like enough of the characters through these three adult books to make the fall of Starlight Beacon really hit? And then how did you juggle the comics with telling the same story as the books?
Yeah. So reading reading Light of the Jedi, I couldn't keep half the characters straight because there's so many. They throw so much at you. It's like drinking from a fire hose. And how I balanced it with the comics. So fortunately, so I follow Kevin Scott and a lot of the authors on Twitter and stuff like that. And people would ask, "Hey, I'm reading these. Where do I need to like you were saying, stop so I don't spoil stuff?" So in a similar sense, I went and I think it was issue 6 or 7 uh, from phase 2 that you would read up to, and that was Light of the Jedi, and then the back half was Rising Storm because issue 12 is the reveal or the first introduction of the Leveler, um, which is of course the main sort of uh, mystery baddie, if you will, in the Fallen Star, right? Um, and and so I kind of stuck straight to the so rather than bounce too much between comics, I just did the book straight through. Um, as far as like, did it have a did it hit emotionally? Like Fallen Star was the only one I listened to on audio. I read the other two, and it was one of those where listening to it in the car because they could do the sound effects and like put so much emotion into the voices that I almost felt it more listening to it than I did reading it. And so to answer your question in a long roundabout way, yes, I do think that especially with the interaction between Elzar and Stellan, um, the relationship between Bell and Burry, and even Leox and Alfie,
Yeah.
like our side characters, right? Like the way that everybody is so intertwined, like at the end, like so interconnected and so reliant upon each other. The fact that Avar wasn't there, it was okay for me, because she is off doing other stuff as far as like the Drangir threat, which we really only get in the comics, and I think that's also in the younger books or the youth
Yeah.
young
Uh,
adult books. I think.
Into the Dark covers the Drengir pretty well, and also that is where Leox and Affy and Geode first appeared.
Right.
So I knew them from that. Like I had started reading Into the Dark, and then that one kind of lost me a bit. That I was like, okay, I'm jumping to Rising Storm. And then once I got done Rising Storm, I went to this. I was like, I was already still introduced to Leox and Geode and all them. So I was like, oh, I know these guys. Like I haven't finished their book yet, but I know that they somehow end up here. But I did go back and read Into the Dark. But
Mhm.
yeah. And that's kind of the other thing about the villains. Like they will kind of at times jump around. Like Drengir, like you said, are in the comics. They're also in the youth stuff, right? Like you get the
Mhm.
Leveler, you get Denial that are pretty much in all forms of these stories. So speaking of the Nile, just your thoughts on them. Do you think that they are a good villain for the High Republic? Because that was something else that they really, I think, tried to publicize a lot going into this. It's like, oh, these are going to be a threat that the Jedi, like, obviously they can't use Sith, so it's like, all right, what type of threat are you going to have? And most of them are kind of like pirates that are fine with just, you know, burning stuff down, causing chaos, stuff like that. What are your thoughts on the Nihil and the Nihil's leadership, and if you think that they were worthy villains for this first phase?
I love the Nile as a villain, of course, and Marchion Ro for me is a top tier villain. Like he's again, I'm not sort of well read across all of the Star Wars content, but from a calculating like long game point of view, it's like, you know, if Palpatine didn't have his throne, like his sort of lofty position, right? Like, because of course Palpatine's playing the long game.
Mm-hmm.
Marchion's like playing the long game. He's sowing the seeds throughout all three books, right? And I felt that, and I think I might have tweeted about it when after I read Light of the Jedi, was that what they were setting up for was a sort of commentary looking at the Jedi hubris and what eventually leads to their downfall, right? And in the prequels,
Mm-hmm.
and overlooking the little man, right? They think that they've squashed everything. They think that there is no threat. Oh, we took care of Kosiv, and therefore he was the eye, right? And so
Right.
he's gone. And then you get Rising Storm, and it's like, oh crap, this is way worse, and we clearly overestimated this. Oh, Lorna D is the eye. Nope.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the
Mm-hmm.
audiobook, The Tempest Runner, which I still have waiting in my Audible library. And so then you get the piece de resistance of just completely destroying the beacon, the light that, that is that sort of draw to the Jedi for the for the common person, the thing that they look to the Jedi for. And so I thought that they were the perfect sort of encapsulation of that overlooked enemy that can topple a giant, basically.
Yeah, well said. I would say for me, like the bottom rung Nihil are not too scary for me. It's Markion that
Mhm.
is the terrifying one. He's got his plan. He puts it in motion. He takes over, but he's not like, I know people would say, well, that kind of sounds like Palpatine, but I mean, like he obviously doesn't have any of those special abilities. He's not a Sith hiding in plain sight. He's just like a guy who is going to take over and become the leader of the Nile, and is pretty frightening, especially the way Mark Thompson does his voice.
Yes,
Like I definitely recommend the audiobooks for people because Mark Thompson's Markion Rowe voice is very, very good.
it's so good, and it's very calm and intense. And yeah,
Yes,
you're right.
that's a pretty good
I
impersonation.
thanks.
Yeah, so that is our basic thoughts on those two questions I was going to ask about the Nihil as a whole and the characters as a whole. So I guess let's just kind of dive into the plot of the book. So in the last one, the Republic Fair was attacked while they were on Valo, and that caused a bunch of issues. The Jedi and the Republic have now gone on the offensive to try to attack the Nile, and that's what Avar Kriss is doing. She's looking for Lorna D, who they believe is the Eye of the Nile, as you said. The true leader of the Nihil, of course, is Markion Ro, and he is about to launch another attack on the Jedi and the Republic. And Starlight Beacon is the only thing that stands in his way. So, of course, what is he going to do? He's going to try to plan to bring down Starlight Beacon, and that is the main gist of this. And most of this book takes place on Starlight Beacon. Um, the one complaint I read is that people think that maybe Starlight Beacon was a little too small in this book, like wasn't as bustling as it has been in other appearances. I didn't really get that in this, but I would also assume because they did evacuate a few people, like people, you're only going to focus on a certain amount of people when you're doing this book, right? And it's going to be the people that the readers have kind of gotten to know: the Jedi, Leox, Geode, Affy, Pika, and Joss,
Mhm.
right? That are
The Adrians. Yeah.
yes, Adrian's over there. Those are who you're mainly focusing on in this story, and I was totally fine with that approach. Like I said, this is my favorite of those books, and I think it's, like you said, the way that I can't talk up the audiobooks enough. The way that they do the music, they'll throw in Across the Stars in there. They'll throw in the Force theme. They'll hitch in the feelings with that. They'll the acting by Mark Thompson, the voices he does, the sound effects, lightsabers, blasters, door closing, door openings. That all that stuff makes this feel like you're really listening to like an audio play. Then they do actually have real audio plays, like you said. Tempest Runner by which has Lorna Deep by Cavan Scott is one of those examples where they have a whole cast of people doing those voices and such. But it really makes you feel the emotion when you're listening to it. I kind of wonder if I would feel as strongly about it if I hadn't listened to it, but definitely recommend that. There's multiple ways to listen. If you don't want to pay money on Audible for everything, check your local library. They might have the audiobook, or sometimes if you have a library card, they will have a program called like Libby or Hoopla, which will have audiobooks that you can rent and listen. And that's how I listened to like a few of these after my Audible was expired.
Yeah, and if you have my John, my co-host, he if you have Spotify Premium, there are
Oh
actually some
yes.
audiobooks available on Spotify Premium too. Like Light of the Jedi is on there, for sure. Uh, so that is another option too. It may not be like up to date, like there may be a time window where it's not available,
Mm-hmm.
but Spotify Premium is also an option for that.
Yes, thank you for that, because I forgot that they put those on there. Yeah, so we kind of also see Bel Zettifar and Buryaga with their masters Nibasik and Indira Stokes. Bel has a new master as of Rising Storm because of Loden. Um, well, Loden disappearing, and then at the end of Rising Storm, they find him and he dies. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that was
uh,
that was that was brutal.
Bel goes through it, man. Bel has had a rough life. Buryaga is a Wookiee Jedi. We got really excited. We saw a Wookiee Jedi was going to be in the Acolyte. It's not Buryaga, though, everyone, unfortunately. He's kind of left in a state of MIA at the end of this one.
Hmm.
We don't know if he's fully dead, but we're led to believe he's dead. I haven't read all of phase 2 or phase 3, so if he comes back, I don't know at this point, but yeah. And Nibasik is Buryaga's master during this. She is going to die. We get Reginald Cole, if I said his name right, but he was a cool Jedi. He ends up dying as well in this story. Most of the people we're introducing here are going to end up dying in the story.
Yeah.
And he was the one that captured Chancey Yarrow and Nan, and those are both Nihil that are captured by the Jedi, and we do get bits of them. Chancey Yarrow was in another project. I'm blanking on which one right now, but Nan was also in Into the Dark. They mention that a few times in here, that when she runs into Affy, Geode, and Leox, she kind of starts to remember them. Otherwise, she kind of put them out of her head. I think Chancey Yarrow was in Out of the Shadows, if I remember correctly. Okay, so like you said, they're trying to capture Lorna D. They do. at some point. That is what Tempest Runner is about, but that takes place before this as well. So
Mhm.
all of that stuff is going on in there. And you said you haven't listened to that one yet?
No, it's in my library. It's waiting to be enjoyed.
I'll say I thought it was all right. The first half of it I really enjoyed. The first hour or so I thought it was really great, and then it becomes solely about Lorna D pretty much, and I don't really care for Lorna D, so I was kind of out on that one. But I know some people really like Lorna, so for some people that'll be fun. Stellan Gios is now the Marshal of Starlight Beacon because Avar has left to hunt down Lorna D. And this is where he is having probably a huge struggle. Stellan kind of goes through it in this one too. So Elzar and him had kind of had a little bit of a falling out in Rising Storm, right? And Elzar went to go meditate on I forget what planet it was, but on a planet with
on Letaloo with Orla.
Yes,
Orla Jareni.
yes, with Orla Jareni, and they will come back on. But it's been a few like months at this point since they've seen each other, and you know they've been a little awkward. Elzar also had some awkward encounters with Avar at the end of Light of the Jedi, so he's had a lot of awkwardness. But they originally were like three, not a dyad, but a triad. They were very connected and kind of all had feelings for each other.
They were buddies, they were the schoolyard triangle, if you will.
And when it comes to Stellan, I think one reason I really like Stellan is because my favorite character is Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Mark Thompson does almost like an Obi-Wan voice for Stellan. He's got the beard, he's the wise, pragmatic guy. I think that's why I like Stellan so much. But he really struggles in this role as being the Marshal of Starlight Beacon and juggling all of this stuff, especially once the attack happens and he ends up, he will end up dying. Unfortunately, Stellan dies, but Elzar in this story, if we look at Elzar's character, he ends up coming back. He feels a lot better than when he had left. I feel like he thinks he is on the right path, but I would think he has kind of a setback here. He gets really, really angry and ends up, when they're going with the Chancey Yarrow and Nan are kind of fleeing. He knows that the Nihil are on the ship, and as they're trying to escape, he, if I remember correctly, it's been a little bit, he cuts down Chancey Yarrow. Just kills her.
Yes, he did. Yes, he just he doesn't think, he just jumps and he hacks her in half. And it's as Stellan's trying to get down the elevator shaft to get to him, because to get to the it was to the escape pods, I think.
Right. They were all going to the escape pods,
or was to get the gas suit. I can't remember, but
that's what it was. It was to get. I think Stellan was going for the gas suit, right? And then I think Chancey Yarrow and Nan were trying to escape. But he mistakes her for a Nihil saboteur. I mean, she kind of was, but she was also, I think at that point, kind of like, screw the Nihil. I just want to kind of get out of here. She was kind of.
And they were trying to fix the thrusters, right? They were trying to bring the thrusters back online. They were trying to get the auxiliary power to kick back on. And Elzar thought that they were sabotaging the auxiliary power supplies. And he loses himself in that moment.
So I guess, where do you think that kind of leads Elzar going forward? In Rising Storm, he kind of has this bad vision of his friends, perishing and stuff like that, kind of Anakin Skywalker-esque, I guess you could say. And then he does kind of have like this moment. I don't know if you want to equate it to like the Tusken Raider scene, but I mean, like because that was a little bit more anger and getting back at them for killing his mom. But this is like, for Elzar, he does think he's doing the right thing, but it's also like, maybe just wait a little bit and not jump right into action. Maybe ask some questions. Where do you think this leads Elzar as we maybe look forward into the other phases for his character? Is there redemption in store? Can he come back from this?
So I think for Elzar, and it's one of the things that kind of gives him protection from the leveler, right? Because he kind of unconnects himself from the Force.
Yeah.
Is finding the balance between the light and the dark, right? So he's throughout all three books, he's a very emotional, leaning character, whereas Stellan is, as you said, very pragmatic, very by the book, very buttoned up. Elzar is like the polar opposite, and he's the perfect counterpoint to Stellan, I think. And I see Elzar being effectively by default, because of what happens, foisted into that. He's the uh, he's like that unassuming leader. He's put in that leadership role, and you see it towards the end of the book. Like, he becomes centered, he becomes clear visioned as far as making decisions is concerned. And I think that, of course, he loses Orla along the way as well. So and loses one of his best friends in Stellan. And so I think it forces him to to both wrestle with those emotions and then control them. And so I do think that there would be definitely room for or a pathway for a redemption, not necessarily redemption, but refinding himself and recapturing that control over his emotions and by extension the Force.
Yeah, I would think that that's probably one of the goals that they have going forward in this story. And again, I've not read Phase 3. Phase 2 goes backwards in time. Phase 3 kind of continues off of this. So if you are listening and you do know, don't tell me, because I'm going to experience that. But I would think that that is the main story that they're seeming to tell. It seems like they really want to focus on Elzar going forward at some point of how do we tell this guy's story, because he was kind of a bigger deal than I thought Elzar Mann would be when we first read Light of the Jedi. He kind of really comes into it in Rising Storm heavily, and then this book heavily, where I'm like, oh, we're really focusing on Elzar and kind of his battle with his own demons and like you said, balance of the Force. And I guess that is something we can talk about too, is the leveler, right? Like you said, is something that is killing the Jedi in this story. And it is kind of like this horror type creature of, it feeds on the connection to the Force and will kind of turn them into a husk, right? Is that the appropriate way of saying that? A husk that will like collapse into dust after a certain point.
It's almost like if you've ever seen The Mummy, when Imhotep like consumes people. That's effectively, I think, what it's doing. It's draining all of the life force from them to sort of power itself.
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't thought about that movie in a long time. But yes, you have this thing like almost like a leeching off of people. But like you said, Elzar is not as affected by it because he's kind of detached himself from the Force. I guess you could kind of think like Luke Skywalker in Last Jedi, kind of like shutting himself off of the Force, and he's not as. They notice that this thing doesn't affect everyone else on this beacon. It's just affecting the Force sensitive people. So that has kind of become kind of the running theme on how they can operate certain things, right? Like when they're trying to investigate, they have people go with the Jedi, people that volunteer, because they're like, it's affecting us. And some of those people are like, well, why would I want to go protect you? Pretty much, some of them are very anti going there. And then you have people like Leox or other people that will go out of their way and walk with the Jedi and make sure that everything is fine. And I thought that was a pretty interesting way of exploring that. This is something that the Nihil are people that are just raiders. but they have access, thanks to Markion Ro, to this thing that can just absolutely take out a Jedi in no time. And we lose a lot of them this way. Like I said, we lose Reginald, we lose Orla from this. We're gonna lose
Nib.
Nib. Indira's like on her deathbed due to this thing. She somehow holds on. Stellan gets very weak from it and is very injured and weakened from it. Yeah, and we think maybe Burryaga sacrifices himself down there. Like, you know, Bell has to go out to the med station, and he was told not to come back. He's going to come back because he feels like he needs to. He needs to go help. He's, you know, leaves Ember with his master, so that way Ember is looking over Indira. But, you know, Bell comes up with a plan to kind of separate the medical tower from the rest of Starlight, and that's how originally he kind of gets stuck over there, you know, and having to kind of go in between. But yeah, the station breaks in half, and that's kind of where I think is interesting, that we're kind of having to zip around certain things, because I'm going to talk the comics eventually, and those comics are going to take place on like the top half, right? And then this book takes place on the bottom half, and it's very interesting the way that they decided to break that up. But yeah, like you said, Elzar, he's going to kill Chancellaro, who was at that time helping them and was one of the only people that could help them from this ship is drifting into the atmosphere of Irem. And that's kind of the countdown that is going on. There's so many countdowns going on in this book, I feel like. But you have the leveler down there, you have the ship falling, and you also have the Nihil. Like, you have so much stuff going on in this book. I think that's why I really enjoy it so much.
Well, and each book has its own countdown, right? So yeah, the book 1 has the Tabana gas flying towards the sun. Book 2 is the countdown to the Republic Fair.
Yeah.
And then book 3 is obviously the countdown to Starlight Beacon, you know, falling out of orbit.
And it comes down to Elzar and Stellan at the end. And Stellan sends Elzar to escape. And Stellan's going to stay on this, knowing that he couldn't save the station. Now, they do prevent it from landing on an actual city on Irem, and that's kind of another part in the story where they're kind of cutting to Irem people that are seeing this thing start dropping, and the Irem officials, and, you know, seeing it from their perspective. But Stellan Geos does end up perishing as it lands. Another thing funny too is he had a droid that was gifted to him by Elzar, JJ5145, and that kind of gets on Stellan nerves quite a bit. But that droid was pretty funny, I thought.
Yeah, the audiobook. Yeah, again, the voicing was really well done, and Stellan every time he's like, "Thank you, 4-5," you know, and it's just a fun, you know, it's that nice break from the seriousness that is going on 95% of the time.
Yes, and we do have the droid did survive. They inform a group of surviving Jedi that Stellan did go down with it, and he presents Stellan's lightsaber to Elzar Mann. And you have Avar there at the bottom, because she was originally on the top part during like the whole split at a certain point when we're talking about the comics. And they are both mourning Stellan's death. Like we said, these three were very tight. Elzar is pretty much vowing to become the best Jedi possible so he can live up to Stellan's legacy. And it also leaves the seat on the Jedi Council empty. So I guess you could maybe read into it that maybe Elzar is possibly going to get that seat. I don't know. Bell survives. I don't know. Who are we left with at the end of this? We're left with Bell, Elzar, Avar,
Indira.
Indira
makes it. Leox and Alfie make it off, right?
Yes.
But like from a Jedi perspective, yeah, you're not left with many. Yeah, it's catastrophic, of course. Yeah, there's not a whole lot left after all of it.
Which is interesting because, like, I think that's fine because you want to have actual stakes, right? And
Oh
like
yeah.
you said, reading Light of the Jedi at first, you're like, how? Oh my god, there's so many characters. How am I going to keep up with these? They start trimming those pretty quickly, because we lose like Jorah Mali in Light of the Jedi. Um, we lose Loden at that point, but he's actually alive. Then he dies. So like they start killing off a lot of these Jedi, and this one in particular, like I said, we by the halfway point you already lose like 3 of these Jedi. Orla's gone, Nib is gone, and Reginald was gone.
Mm-hmm.
And he was cool. He kind of sounded like a southern guy, almost like Leox with his
Leox was my
McConaughey.
favorite because it's Matthew McConaughey. Just all right.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was talking with about Into the Dark, I had, for another podcast, had to watch Interstellar, which has Matthew McConaughey, and he's doing mostly a regular Matthew McConaughey voice. But it is like all I could think about was Leox anytime he was on screen, especially it's a space movie. So you're like, it was funny. And then I had to jump on after that and talk about Into the Dark, and I'm like, having Matthew McConaughey in my head, I was like, I need to see him as a live action Leox now.
100%.
Let's get
for
a
sure.
movie with Leox Gyasi in it, and let's cast Matthew McConaughey. It's the most slam dunk you're gonna get. But yeah, we lose a lot of Jedi in this book, and it really makes you wonder how they can go forward from here. And I was very excited to dive into Phase 2. And then you read Phase 2 is 150 years before this. And you're like, dang, that kind of sucks. I did start reading Phase 2, though, and I really enjoyed Convergence. I did the audiobook of that, and that, again, like the character work has been great. It does feature Irem, so there's some ties to it, but it is very, very different from Phase 1. I also have like a folder in my phone of the concept art of characters for each phase. So that way, if I'm reading and I forget what somebody looks like, I go into my folder and I'm like, oh yeah, that's who I'm looking at right now, or this is who I'm picturing in my mind.
Yeah, the art books are really cool. Getting those visual concepts for, well, like you said, for each character. You get it, of course, in the comics to a degree, but they're so better fleshed out, in
And not
those.
everybody's
Correct. Not
well
everyone's in the
shown in
comics.
the comics. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, the one thing you're talking about, Burry, he's left to deal with the Rathtars that escaped
Yes.
from the cargo hold, right? And you're like, how is he getting out of that one? But then so I went to Comic-Con last year on San Diego,
Oh,
and
really?
at the publishing booths, they all had, we learned, I guess, minor spoiler, that Burry does live somehow. So there were
Yes. Yeah.
pins that, Burryaga lives, Burry lives. And you're like, oh, all right. So listening to it after the fact, like the peril, right, that they're under, but you're like, wait, somehow he's going to get out of this. Like, I don't know how that's going to happen, but
That's what I
I
thought I had heard too. I was like, all right, cool, because that was the one I was most upset about was Burry, because I love Burryaga. So
well, and you get more of him
yes,
in this book, right? Like you didn't really get his character in the adult novels, anyways, until this book, until him and Belle like team up, and you get that personality, or that as much personality as you can get from Wookiee.
they had a great relationship, like because Burry could, I mean, Belle could speak Wookiee, right? So
Mhm.
She-Rook, so he would talk about, like, you would get him translating pretty much when they're talking. And they would mention about like watching holo dramas together, and like scary holo dramas or holo horror film type stuff, and just getting like, these two were pretty young. They were pretty young when this stuff is going on, so of course they have like a whole different uh outlook than some of the other Jedi that we meet, right? So getting those things where like, yeah, they just want to watch like movies together when they're not doing Jedi stuff. And the fact that they get separated and he has to like, Bell is mourning a friend, not knowing that he's alive. It's kind of like how he was mourning his master, not knowing his master was alive. I mean, he kind of
Mhm.
had the thought that Loden was alive, but everybody else was telling him like, move on, But yeah, so Bell is my favorite of these characters. So I was happy to see he made it out. I was very, very scared for his life. I will say that's something they've done very well in this, is making me fear for each person's life. Because once they started cutting off some of these people, I didn't think they were going to kill Loden. And then at the end of the first book, he's captured, and you're like, oh. And they've done a really good job of like making me feel like any of these people can die.
Yeah, and that's the perfect. I say that's the perfect thing. It's the perfect thing from a storytelling perspective with where we are, because unlike a lot of our current content, TV content, right? We know certain characters have to make it to certain parts of the story. There is no plot armor for anybody in the
Right.
books, or in this era, right? Because we don't know where we have to get to. So it makes it that much more intense, like you were saying, and the buy-in for the characters and the actual tension that the
Yeah.
authors bring across. It's really enjoyable, because you don't get that as much with the TV stuff right now.
Yeah, and I think so there's pluses and downsides to the way Star Wars is structured, right? Star Wars, of course, is always told out of order, just because it started with episode 4. So going from there, it's all out of order. Sometimes that's a strength, because you can have stuff like Bad Batch bring characters like Fennec Shand in, and you're like, okay, so like it ties a character from post episode 6 now into between 3 and 4, and you're like, that makes it seem like this character has been around a whole lot longer than they have. Then there's the downside of, you know having, let's say, an Ahsoka show, and that like now if people go back and watch another show, they know Ahsoka's going to survive.
Mhm.
Or that's not really a great example, but I'm trying to think of another one. Like, they always tell these stories out of time, so they'll be like, oh, here's Obi-Wan, so you're like, okay, well, I know Obi-Wan's going to survive to episode 4,
Mhm.
in his series. We know he's going to survive, and then so you have to worry about the other characters. And then they try to do that bait and switch with the Grand Inquisitor, and you're like, but the Grand Inquisitor was alive. So then you're like, all right, so either they're disregarding canon or he's not actually dead. And then it turns out he's
Mhm.
not actually dead. And that kind of spoils you on it. But where it can be a positive is when you're in a brand new era like this. And really the only characters you know are Yoda, because he's 900 years old. And thankfully they don't put him in a lot of the action so far. I think he's in some of like the more younger stuff, but like in the adult books and stuff, he's not really featured. He may be mentioned. And then you have like Yarl Poof and Yaddle, right? All the people that have been around for hundreds of years. The rest of the characters, the plus side about being in a whole new time frame is we can do whatever we want. Like, these characters can be introduced, they can get killed off, they can stay, then they can show up in the Acolyte, whatever. So there is one character with plot armor right now with Vernestra Rowe, because
Vernestra, yeah.
she should go up there, but with her being like one of the more popular ones, I doubt they were going to kill her off anyway. But yeah, so that very exciting time. This is what I've been asking for, is bring us a time that doesn't have all these characters that we already know. In those other books that I've talked about before that were coming out that were not High Republic, they would come out as like, oh, here's Heir to the Jedi, I think is what one was called, and it was a Luke story between episodes 4 and 5. And you're like, okay, whatever. Then you're like, oh, here's a Han story right around the time Solo comes out. They're like, here's a Han book. You're like, all right, this one's like between 3 and 4 or whatever. And then they're like, oh, here's a Leia book. This one is before episode 7. You're like, okay, that's a little intriguing. But none of these were like connected. You're
Mm-hmm.
like, they'd be like, here's a Tarkin book. And you're like, great, just who I wanted to read about all the time. So then it was no cohesive story being told there. It was just writers writing, I'm going to write a story about this character in this time frame, and they'll put it out. This storyline, at least, it feels like what I really love about it is being able to just pull up the next book and read the next chapter of these characters' lives. And it kind of feeling like a full story. And that's helped and hindered by the fact that they have so many stories in each phase. But I recommend checking out the younger tier ones if people haven't. Some of those are very short, especially if you do the audiobook. Like the middle grade ones are like 3 to 5 hours. If you're doing
That's
the
not
audio,
bad. That's not bad at
very
all.
quick. Yeah. And then some of them, like the young adult ones, are around maybe just 2 hours shorter of the main ones. So those might take a little longer. I was thankful I had a trip to Florida where I was driving, so
Mm-hmm.
that's 14 hours. I was able to listen to like 3 books there and back. It was great.
Yeah, I listened to most of Fallen Star on my way to and from Chicago for a work trip, so I got through like
That's awesome.
2/3 of it in that time frame. But to your point about the timeline and where we're at and what they can do with the stories, as we lead into Acolyte, which I think is like 120-ish years,
About that, something like that.
like or I guess after phase 2 and phase 3, like where we're at now, is that the in the trailer you get one of the witches talking about the Force and who has the right to use it and stuff like that, and it's touched on in like the first issue from the phase 2 parts of the High Republic comics. You've got your 2 main characters on Jeddah, and Jeddah, from what we know, from what we learned from like Rogue One and a couple other things, right, is the seat of it's one of the powerhouses of the Force, right? And on Jeddah, you have multiple sects of Force users, not just Jedi, not just Sith don't really exist, right, as far as everyone else knows,
Right.
at this time, right? But you have the Night Sisters, of course, who use the Force, but there are other religious groups who tap into the Force for their own usage, and the Jedi are kind of looked down upon for being gatekeepy, as being like, oh, we're the only ones who can use the Force. And so I thought it was interesting that you get that little nugget in the trailer for the Acolyte, because they set the groundwork for it 200 years before that, back when they're doing the pathfinding and everything like that. So the fact that they can introduce additional groups who utilize the Force, which I know has been a big bugaboo for people, at least as far as like who can be trained, who can be Force sensitive, who can do this and that and the other, to realize that if you think about the Force more as like a religion, right, which in a way it is, right, and who can access that and who can tap into it and why they use that thing for their life, it starts to really kind of paint a picture for, like I said earlier, like the hubris for the Jedi, thinking that they're this beacon, right, to use that. And but in reality, there are others who can do, they may not use it the same way, but they use it just the same, and that their view of themselves leaves them vulnerable, which of course we know is sort of that downfall. So I think what they're doing with the High Republic, as it leads into what we eventually see in the prequel trilogy, is really cool, because it's really introducing us as Star Wars fans to others who are able to use this power that is so mystical and amazing and all that stuff.
Yeah, and like on top of that, like when you're talking about like the prelude to the prequel trilogy, this is kind of where they start getting a little too buddy-buddy with like the Chancellors and the Republic. Um, Starlight Beacon is an initiative by the Republic to get the Jedi like out there, and then they kind of become more like, with the Republic Fair going on Valo and stuff, and they have to worry about that. Like, this is kind of where they start becoming more centralized to Coruscant too. At this point, they have all of these other temples that are elsewhere that people are stationed to, but it seems like because they start becoming super close with the Chancellor and dealing with politics and all that because of the Nihil, that they probably focused more around that temple on Coruscant then, and end up becoming a little too focused on Republic stuff that doesn't really concern the Jedi. And
Yeah,
that's where we kind of pop up in Phantom Menace, of course.
Yeah, and that's something that they touch on in Fallen Star, with the fact that, at the end of Rising Storm, Stellan saves Chancellor So, very dramatically, of course, and so he becomes the poster boy for all the media coverage, and
Yeah,
he gets pulled into meetings that she's having with other senators and stuff like that, to be kind of like that focal point for the Jedi Council as it relates to political matters. And Orla, I think Orla gives him shtick about it. And I think it's really interesting because Stellan, and I'm kind of jumping back into the story, but Stellan, the thing that he struggles with is who he is outside of the Force, right? Because he feels like he's become so disconnected, from anything other than being a Jedi, right? That he's lost who he is kind of as a person. And, the fact that he's being trotted out there as like this
poster boy.
Yeah, is, like you said, it's really kind of commingling in a way that will be turn out to be very disastrous.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that happens like in Into the Dark, but like when there's a kid on there named Wreath Silas who has to go, he likes being on Coruscant, but his master wants him to get out there, and his master was Jorah Mali, who died in Light of the Jedi, and he'll learn about that in that book, but he doesn't want to like be out on the frontier, and their whole plan is to like send these Jedi out to the frontier to get people excited about the Republic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to get people to know what the Jedi are for and stand for. And they start becoming synonymous with the Republic, and I think that's kind of where it starts. And like Nan, who's in this book too, asks Wreath like, "So you guys like only protect people in the Republic?" Like, and he's like, "No, we protect all people." But then like the fact that he had to answer that is because the perception is that they're part of the Republic. And he's like,
Mm-hmm.
we're not really part of the Republic. We're doing this for the Republic, but we would help anybody. And that's what I mean when they're getting a little too close. And that's what we open up Phantom Menace, and Chancellor Valorum has sent 2 Jedi Knights to go talk on the behalf to the Trade Federation for
Handle a
Naboo.
trade dispute. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
It's like you're supposed to keep the peace, but are you supposed to be politicking like that? I don't know. Like that's where they've kind of gotten like the Chancellor is the one saying like, "Hey, can we dispatch 2 Jedi out here?" He shouldn't have that call. He shouldn't be asking the Council for that.
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of stuff that you start to see the seeds planted in these first wave here.
For sure.
All right. Anything else about Fallen Star at all? I feel like we were all over the place, but I hope people learned stuff about it.
The only thing that I had questions about, and it kind of came from Rising Storm, but it fleshes out here more because they're kind of the main bad guy, if you will. But the levelers, right? So the historic nature of them as a creature, and how they were created, who created them, and why does Marchion Ro know where they are? And this is kind of going back to Rising Storm, right? But
Right.
there's and I don't know if we're going to get kind of a backfill ever, I guess, because I mean phase 2 is done now, which would have been kind of an option for describing it a bit more. But what is the purpose? What was the original purpose for them? Are these like, were they Sith, or not Sith, but who were they used to defeat the first time? because their sole purpose is to defeat Force users. So that was one of the things I was hoping that we would get more of, maybe from phase 2, or even like references to, and I don't know that we actually have.
I've heard that they do discuss some of that stuff. I mean, I don't know how well, but I heard like we get background on Markion's family and maybe stuff with the leveler in phase 2. I mean, like I said, I haven't seen it so far in what I've read, which was one book, but that's what I've heard people say. Like, they're like, why did they go back and tell something that long ago? It's like, oh, they're giving you background on this, this, and this, and I'm like, all right, but I haven't gotten to that stuff, so I don't know if how deep they actually go into it.
Right.
But I think we'll probably get a good chunk of that in phase 3, if not. They have to explain it, right? It can't just be these things that are that powerful without being explained. I would think.
Well, and there's still a mystery, right? Because nobody ever figured out what it was. So yeah, it's, and I've actually got the comics. So the Fall of Starlight, I think, is what the comic, the phase 3 comic, High Republics are, and I'm slowly amassing them, and we'll binge them kind of once I've got a solid start to it, because I can't wait 4 or 5 weeks between issues. I don't have that kind of patience. But no, I mean, the just to kind of wrap, I guess the story is, I loved the, listening to it again. I loved the emotion, the struggle, the realization that they all like live, through the characters, right? Of course, which is every story, but as they realize, that things are going to, up a creek with no paddles, and the way that they have to pivot, right? And like I said earlier about Elzar, the way he has to kind of break out of his funk, and he's forced to do so, and he's forced to take that role as leader, which he doesn't really want. He doesn't want to be that. The way that Bell grows out of, from Rising Storm, losing Loden, having to adjust to Indira, and the way that he matures in the story, right, to be kind of that leader, to try and maintain calm. And it was almost one of those where, like, all of the leaders, or sorry, all of the characters who became leaders were the ones who weren't there originally, whereas Stellan, who is like and I'm not saying he wasn't a leader, but it was almost like he was one who had to be helped, right? Like it was the point where he could no longer be that like rock for everyone. He needed the support. And so it was one of those where characters like Stellan, where that's why I loved Obi-Wan, because Obi-Wan, the show, that is, like, he's a broken human because he's had to be that core for that group for so long, and he eventually finds himself again. Like Stellan, I feel like, was the same way. Like, he was this rock for everybody, and he became like this, it was too much, right? And he broke down, and he had to have that support to help bring him back. And in the end, he realized who he was. Like, it's like he finds himself by the end, and he sacrifices himself for everyone else. And so he does the ultimate sort of leader move. So I love the way that Charles, Cavan, and Claudia all tied this main story together. Like the way that they had you buy in and feel for the characters. And I thought the way that Claudia finished this story, or at least this portion of the story, was chef's kiss. It was so good.
Yeah, I guess it was intentional. I don't know, but like how each one of these books is one of their stories, right? Like Avar is really focused on like the Jedi, Elzar in the second one, Stellan on this one, and those are like the three. They are a triad in this story. Friends that have grown up together as Jedi, maybe had some feelings for each other, like Avar and Elzar, maybe, right? We didn't really talk about this, but Stellan had a weird complex about Avar in this book. He would catch on to it. He's like, why am I letting this like affect me so much, right? Like, he wants to, you kind of see the other side of this conversation in the comics, but he kind of says like he's the marshal now at some point. He's, because she just kind of took off and was doing her own thing and wasn't supposed to be doing that, right? And he had to step in and kind of fill in for that. But like you said, he kind of finds himself again at the end. He was kind of letting some stuff get in his way at that point. Maybe a little cockiness of being named Marshal of Starlight Beacon. And really when it all falls apart, he's like, crap, probably didn't want to be Marshal right now. But yeah, I think he was just a very interesting character, and he makes the ultimate hero move of going down like a captain almost, right? Like going down with the ship and saving everyone else. Or at least hundreds of lives, thousands of lives if this thing was gonna
millions of lives if that crashes into
the city,
into that city, and you just said that. I didn't think about it at all, but Avar being the light of the Jedi, Elzar being the rising storm, and Stellan being the fallen star. Like, you're right, the titles encapsulate who they are as characters.
Yeah, because the storm also, so the storm is a play on words, right? You got the rising storm that Markion's talking about, which is the storm of the Nile. But you also get all of these with Elzar, all of these metaphors about like tides and like water and a lot of rising stuff like in him, like tides and storm and so it plays into him pretty well there. But yeah, so I wonder how, now knowing that they named it like that, I really wonder how that's going to play out when you read like phase 2 or phase 3, if they have a similar theme with what character is kind of like the highlighted focus. I'm going to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, I definitely got to do that going forward, because I did not put that together until you literally just said that. So there's always going to be wordplay in those titles.
And I don't, and I think I'll say it wasn't mine. I know I've seen that online, but also one of our guests, I forget who, maybe Jamie, who talked Rising Storm, made that connection as well. So shout out to Jamie, who was on for Rising Storm, drawing those comparisons, because I was one of those that looked at Fallen Star. I was like, oh, Starlight Beacon, it's fallen. I get it.
It's literal.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Books are always literal. All right. Well, that'll wrap us up here. So I don't know how I'm releasing these. I've been releasing them every Friday. I'm going to run out before Acolyte launches. So at some point, I'm probably going to end up releasing a couple of these a week, but I don't know if I'm saving this one for last or the comic for last, because then that one will cover the same stuff as this. But either way, we're building into the Acolyte right here. I just want to thank you, Sean, for coming on again. If you wanted to shout out your podcast one more time before we wrap it up.
Of course. Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Love talking talking High Republic stuff. Again, you can find us Force Dyad Podcast, me and John, at Force Dyad Pod on Twitter, at Force Dyad Podcast on Facebook, Instagram. We even have a TikTok, so you want to come watch me do silly dance videos. But yeah, you can find us on all podcast platforms and YouTube. So thanks again.
Yeah. So if this is the last one, I'll roll into phase 2 some point down the line, but I really wanted to get all these out before Acolyte, so I either succeeded or I did not. You'll tell me when this releases. But yeah, very excited to dive into the Acolyte, and can't wait to be watching some actual High Republic live action. Like, I'm just really excited for that. So yeah, we'll have a phase 2 of this at some point, but right now that wraps up phase 1 of the High Republic Road to the Acolyte. Thank you all for watching or listening along. You can like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And you can follow us on all of our social medias at podawakens, or email us podawakens@gmail.com. All right, that'll wrap us up here. Thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you next time when we dive into the Acolyte.